The PC gaming world is littered with extremely powerful top-of-the-line components and snazzy buzzwords to catch the consumer's ever-wandering eye. However, if you manage your expectations accordingly, you can build a perfectly adequate PC under the cost of a single high-end graphics card and not be disappointed with the results. This build is a project I've worked on for the past few weeks. The concept is simple. What is the cheapest brand new build I would recommend for the average casual gamer? Keep in mind this is one of the millions of configurations available to you, and you should always research your own components and decide what is the best for you and your wallet. But without further ado, the first minimum specs build. The Budget King CPU of early 2017 has to go to the Intel Pentium G4560. This dirt cheap processor battles it out with Intel's own Core i3 series, being the first Pentium CPU that offers hyperthreading, essentially allowing it to perform 90% the same as a modern Core i3 at quite literally half the cost. For $65, this was an easy choice. The GPU is a harder decision to make, especially with increasing amount of sales and promotions going on. However, in the spirit of keeping things as cheap as possible, I decided on one of the lower end cards. I narrowed my decisions down to NVIDIA's GTX 1050 or the GTX 1050 Ti, as well as AMD's RX 460 and the RX 470. All performed respectably, so it really boiled down to the price versus performance. I was originally heavily leaning towards the RX 470 as it typically has some of the best performance in this category, but I ended up finding a great deal on the GTX 1050 2GB, and I decided to take the performance hit over spending the extra cash. After all, this project is all about finding the cheapest possible option I would recommend. Keep in mind, I found the GTX 1050 2GB for about $90, so if you're referencing this build for your own, make sure to research which of those options will be the best for you. For a motherboard, I'm using a Micro ATX H110 board from Gigabyte. Something important to consider is the H110, B150, and Z170 chipsets lack native support for the Kaby Lake or 7th generation Intel CPUs. Despite using the same socket being LGA 1151, the first generation motherboards might need a BIOS update in order to be functional. I highly recommend researching this topic before deciding it's something you're able to do. If this is all starting to sound a little over your head, I highly suggest you look into picking up a B250 chipset motherboard, which will natively support the 7th generation Intel CPUs and a few other features at a slight premium. For RAM, I have 8GB of DDR4 2133 MHz. You will need DDR4, but the frequency shouldn't really matter for this level of build. Any manufacturer or model will be fine, just go with something cheap and well rated. I'm using an ADATA stick I got on sale a few weeks ago. For storage, I used a little 120GB SSD for Windows and a few smaller games, and a 1TB hard drive for the larger titles. Powering this little build is a very solid EVGA 450W 80+ bronze rated power supply. This is inexpensive and well-rated supply that should handle your build and future upgrades with ease. It has plenty of PCIe connectors for GPU upgrades as well. I picked this up for $30 on sale, but you can typically find it for about $30 to $40. Another option I was considering is the EVGA 430W 80+ white, trading a few watts and a power rating for a few bucks saved. I typically recommend at least a bronze rated power supply, but that one also seems pretty decent for a low power build. Whatever you decide on, make sure you don't cheap out on your PSU, as it's one of the most important parts of your computer. Now that the actual specifications are out of the way, how successful was I? Well, let's take a look at the results of some benchmarking. Starting off with one of the most popular titles of the past year, and a personal favorite of mine, Overwatch. I was honestly pleasantly surprised to see how well this entry-level build handled Overwatch, even on maxed out settings. Using the Epic preset to crank everything up, the G4560 and the GTX 1050 still managed a 59 FPS average, albeit with a few drops into the high 30s when things got crazy. Fortunately, if you're a bit more of a stickler for solid high FPS performance, simply dropping to a mere Ultra preset quickly jumps the average to 82 and the minimal drop to 53 FPS. This is where I left it for most of my playtesting, and I found it absolutely playable. It looked great and performed very nicely. Moving on to another overly popular competitive title, Counter-Strike Global Offensive. An older title for sure, but one that many people just can't seem to get enough of. With super high FPS culture surrounding the game, I think some folks will appreciate the solid performance shown. Maxing the settings and starting on Dust 2 map painted a picture of an average of 203 FPS and a minimum of 110. After doing some playtesting on a few various maps, I found an average of 153 and a low of 84. Very respectable numbers and absolutely playable by my standards. When I asked around for some suggestions on games to test out, League of Legends was always sort of tossed in there, which I thought was a bit silly since League can pretty much be played on anything with a keyboard, but understandable considering its huge following and popularity with plenty of my friends still sticking it out on their dusty old laptops. In all seriousness though, I didn't bother with a full benchmark, but in the game I played I didn't notice the FPS drop beneath 100, much less 60, so beyond playable. Now of course, I did try a couple of AAA titles that can really push this build to the limit. The first of which is Grand Theft Auto V. Often used as a benchmark game, I was pleasantly surprised with its performance. Letting the game automatically set its values gave a mix of normal, high, and very high settings, essentially lowering texture size due to the minimal 2GB of memory on the GTX 1050, and using higher settings for shaders, reflections, and more to put the Pascal-based GPU to work. And the results were excellently balanced. Despite the normal resolution textures, the game looked fantastic, averaging right at 60 FPS with only a few drops to low 50s made for very smooth gameplay. The last title I tried out was Battlefield 1, which really shows where the GTX 1050 starts to falter. The video settings were automatically set to the high preset, but I went ahead and tried Ultra first. As expected, the GTX 1050 had a hard time keeping up, but still kept a relatively smooth performance with no major spikes or drops. I saw an average of 49 FPS and a minimum of 41, which is a bit too cinematic for my liking. Moving back to the high preset offers a better experience with an average of 55 FPS and a low of 47. Still a little choppy during intensive scenes, but playable. I personally found that the medium preset is where I was happiest with the performance, averaging right at 60 FPS and never dropping below 50. I decided to do the majority of my gameplay on this setting. Despite losing high detail reflections and some texture resolution, the game still looked fantastic. As with most titles, the Battlefield series in particular, multiplayer performance did suffer. Sticking to the medium settings had the FPS averaging at 47 and even dropping down into the 30s in dense areas and events with intensive particle effects. I chose to play on the low setting in favor of better FPS, which hovered in the mid-50s with less noticeable drops during intensive situations. If you do intend to play more graphically intensive titles, especially in multiplayer, the GTX 1050 2GB managed to mostly keep up on lower settings, but I may suggest looking at a higher end card like the GTX 1050 Ti or the RX 470 if you expect solid 60 FPS performance. All in all, I was impressed with the performance of the build, especially considering its dirt cheap price tag. I scrapped this together for about $325 over the course of a month, watching for sales and promos. I'd expect to build something similar, including a case and without the deal hunting, for around $400 to $450 depending on the parts you choose and the deals you find. I'll go ahead and leave a PC part picker link in the description that includes some similar parts that I might suggest. Alright, well that just about wraps it up, so I hope you enjoyed and got some insight for these components. Like if you'd enjoy future builds like this, and if you have any questions or suggestions, leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe for more budget-friendly hardware and more. Thanks for watching everyone.